Hey, Greg, thanks for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me, George.
I love your book, Never Normal. Am I to believe that the duck and cover strategy is not a good one?
I would say it's probably not.
So, on one side, I really love the title of your book and the whole premise because it's true, right? We need to adapt, and we're on this ever increasing hockey stick of a curve of innovation. But on the other side, I also, dude, it stresses me out a little bit. Like as someone who's like always trying to be ahead of the curve a tiny bit, and as someone who's worked on mindfulness and like being content, and now that I'm later in my life, it's like, can I just relax a little bit? Can I settle into a groove just a tiny bit? I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit about how fast the change is and why it's important to adapt.
Sure. So I think it's important, at least from my perspective, and the way I think about change and the way the world is changing and what it means for us as individuals and what it means for our organizations to kind of break apart the concepts of transformation and adaptability. Obviously, they are closely related. They're both responses to this perpetual state of change. But one of the things that I've seen in my work as it relates to digital transformation in particular, and I'm sure you've seen the same kinds of things, is that both the individuals in the organization and the organization at large, from a strategic standpoint, a business model standpoint, a technology standpoint, a cultural standpoint, feel this pressure to change. It's almost like you feel like you have to change everything all at once and that you will never
Hmm.
catch up. And of course, transformation, I mean, it sounds pat and it's trite, I guess, to an extent at this point, is a journey, right? And it's a journey without an end, which is probably the only journey without an end, right? But, um,
Right.
but I think this whole notion of digital transformation as it's become popularized in business over the past handful of years has created this intense pressure to make change truly transformative, to be big, to be you know profound at all times. And I think that's what's
Hmm.
giving you a lot of that feeling of can't I just take a breath? Can't I be mindful? Can't I, kind of stop chasing the shiny object? And one of the things, and really where my work around adaptability came from, and the ideas that a colleague, Ian Patterson, and I put into the Adapt Manifesto, which is available at adaptmanifesto.org. It's a Creative Commons thing; anybody can use it. Nothing to sell. um, where the principles in that manifesto came from are, as we looked at the pressure that transformation put on organizations, and we recognize the ways in which that could even potentially be damaging to an organization or the people in the organization, we tried to identify sort of like the counter principles. And certainly everybody at all times needs to be conscious of the change that's happening around us, acting on the things that are important, and the kind of responding smartly and strategically to change. But not all change needs to be profound. Not all transformation needs to be digital, for that matter. So we do need to be, I think, on our toes and constantly in a position to respond to change, ready to respond to change. But we need to also be measured and smart and strategic about the way we change, where we change, how we change, when we change, and how much we change. And that in many ways recognize, although I don't believe adaptability means go slow, it does mean that small steps we take sequentially over time add up to big change. And that we can, as individuals and as organizations, be more kind of be more measured in the kinds of things we do, and embrace what shouldn't change at the same time as what should. And I think that's important.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it sounds a heck of a lot better than the 3-year transformation initiative where you have a warehouse full of consultants implementing some 3-letter software vendor solution, right? I definitely have come across more CEOs in the past few years that have kind of admitted, hey, this was a whoopsie daisy. I tried to do too much all at once. And but yet I'm also seeing, because we help clients every year with their strategy, their 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, and on. And this year, I've seen more of them come to me and say, our strategy is flexibility. And whereas before it was always, let's hit a bigger number with less money. And it's like our whole strategy is flexibility. I'm like, with what? They're like, everything. I'm like, that's very expensive, right? And so, like, how do you find that balance and adaptability as far as just being flexible in anything imaginable versus like finding that right adaptability?
Yeah, I mean, like, I could say a few things. I mean, you've hit on something that I think is key and important, which is this idea of these organizations trying to do too much all at once, right? And which again relates, to this idea that we had of revolution through evolution, right? Of don't try to do it all at once. Pick your poison, basically. I think in the near term, for organizations to maintain a stance of flexibility or change readiness or agility or adaptability, whatever word you want to use for it, is critically important, right? We're in a phase of intense ambiguity, right? None of us, there's the only thing that's certain about the future is it's uncertain. And organizations do need to be able to hold multiple models in their mind at once, right? Which is a principle of even, traditional futures thinking, right? This idea of the multiple futures, because you don't know exactly how something will play out. And you do need to have a stance that allows you to pivot quickly when the environment changes around you. At the same time, I also think there's sort of a meaningful distinction in being reactive versus being responsive, right? Maybe it's semantics, but I think about reactive or reaction as sort of, anytime the wind shifts, you're blowing with that wind. And that's the kind of thing that could cause a lot of chaos in an organization, because you're really you're not pivoting, you're just kind of wiffle-waffling all over the place, versus responsiveness where you are being smart and strategic about the choices you make when you change direction. So I think that is, flexibility, as your clients are calling it, is a viable near-term strategy. The other thing is sort of somebody who is a strategist by nature, though, is that ultimately, fundamentally, strategy is about choice. So at some point, the organization does need to place bets and make some decisions about the direction they will take and more or less hold to over a course of time. So it might be a matter with your clients of, kind of flexibility in the near term, and a underlying change readiness for the long term, but the willingness to act on a conviction about what the future could and should be and how the company can create that future.
Yeah. And the problem I find, though, is even if they want to, either react or respond, there's just so much debt that they deal with as an organization, right? Not just technical debt, but process debt, people debt. And it just, I've even seen, in budgeting cycles come up, and there's just very large swaths of the budget that are just set aside for tech debt. And I was actually joking with an executive recently. He was like, because he's in charge of innovation, he's like, I'm just going to start labeling all of my budget requests as debt. I'm just going to add debt to the end of it so they'll get approved, because it seems to get approved. I often think that you can take the unread inbox method to it, right? So if my inbox ever gets unwieldy, I'll just do a select all, mark it as unread, or mark it as read, put it in a folder if I ever need to get to it. And now I'm just focusing on the future. I'm curious if you've seen kind of frameworks or things that work for these organizations to stop thinking about the debt. I mean, some of it they have to deal with, but how do you push people forward?
To me, the debt is one of the largest challenges. I wish I had a great answer to that. It is obviously one of the challenges,
be hard,
right? If we're looking at technical debt specifically, and you've seen this, like you're describing it to an extent, I've seen it as well, that, organizations, IT organizations, are implementing this year things they committed to sometimes 3 years ago, right? And they're not fully implemented, fully rolled out. And they know, it's not even like they don't know that by the time they put a tool, a technology, whatever, into the hands of the workforce, it's already outdated, right? It's very, I think it would take a very progressive and in many ways brave organization to say, let's write that off. The market has outpaced our ability to implement yesterday's technology. But that would be a very rare organization. I talk sometimes about this idea of funding the future, and we see the same thing in anything. It could be technology, it could be marketing, it could be whatever. The innovation budget's always the budget that gets cut, right? You take 10% of your budget, you put it against innovation, and when budget cuts come around, it's not the things that aren't working that get cut. It's the things you haven't done yet that get cut. I think organizations do need to be rigorous about doing kind of whatever you think of it as a start, stop, continue kind of process, or a start, stop, improve kind of process, and be kind of rigorous and relentless hatchet men for the things that aren't working or aren't serving the organization anymore, and then be very territorial about wrapping their arms around those funds as innovation funds and ensuring that they don't get cut. I think even bigger, and you touched on this a little bit, than the technical debt a lot of times is the cultural debt. All of the assumptions that are held to be true, even if they no longer suit the organization, all of the people stuff, the human stuff that needs to be rethought, all of the unlearning that has to happen. I think a lot of times, and this has been one of my challenges with digital transformation as a term and as a practice in a lot of ways, is that it lends itself towards this sort of process where leaders mistake technology for transformation, when fundamentally, first and foremost, it is cultural transformation. And if you can't evolve the culture of the organization to be more customer-centric, to be more modern, to be more sort of digital, for lack of a better term, no amount of technology investment is going to improve the state of the organization, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and it really does come down to that human aspect, right? The same reason these transformations fail is the same reason, people trying to get in shape fail, or that your garage stays cluttered, or whatever human thing it is, right?
Garage?
Or, yeah, you should see mine. And similar to how I joke, there are some people that, maybe they don't want to be in a culture of constant change and constant adaptation and all of that. And so as you shift as an organization, maybe, you always hear this, the people who got you to where you are now, they might not be the people that are going to be there to get you to the next phase. But you need to balance that with creating a culture that can embrace the people that you have, right, and give them room. So the one thing people probably get sick of me talking about it, but Gartner, it's actually behind my shoulder here. Gartner has their pace layering, framework, and it's meant for systems. At the bottom, you have your systems of record, then your systems of change, innovation. I like to think about that, though, as far as how people fit into it, right? Because if you have someone who sits in that level, in that system of record, they probably don't want things to change ever, or very rarely, right? Whereas you have someone that's in this system of innovation, they would shoot themselves out of boredom if they were down at the system of record tier. And, it's about finding that right home and the right place for people in an organization to go through that cultural change. Otherwise, I feel like you could lose a lot of good people if you don't do it right.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot, a lot in what you're describing there, right? We can probably have a 4-hour conversation about whether people suck at change or are great at change, and how much of it is environmental and how much of it is personal and psychological and sociological and all of that. But fundamentally, whether it's people, processes, or anything else, in most incumbent organizations, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? You've got a to one extent or another successful business with a working business model, a customer base, a bunch of people in your workforce, right? And those are your systems of record people. There might be plenty of room for incremental change, but transformation becomes a very scary prospect unless over time you find ways to bring those people along with you. I think one of the biggest challenges with any change initiative in any organization is always communication. Whether it's, a bunch of sort of grassroots skunk-worky types of initiatives that are pushing innovation left and right through the organization, or whether it's a leadership team that says this is the new way it shall be, and not actually explaining why is change important right now? Why is this good for the organization? How is it good for you? How will this, what role will you play in the world as it changed and it changes and in the new world? Why is this good for you? How will it make your life better, right? If you told somebody, even in a system of record, that you will be able to do more creative work, more strategic work, more rewarding work, a different kind of work, have a different kind of work-life balance instead of living your life in spreadsheets, let's say, because the spreadsheet stuff can be automated. Even in a system of record, I might go, actually, that sounds interesting. Tell me more. If you simply say your job is being automated, or, or, hey, this thing that you've spent your career building is no longer real or relevant because the consumer has moved on, that's like a shock to the system, right? So there's, I think, a lot of stuff that comes down to communication and bringing people along, creating an environment where people feel bought into the kinds of change that may be happening around them. But also, on the flip side of that, to what you were saying, recognizing that in a legacy organization or a legacy industry, many of which, frankly, have not been disrupted to the extent those of us who wear digital transformation hats or whatever pretend they have been or preach they have been, that there is a lot of value in the traditional bread and butter stuff that a lot of these organizations do.
Yeah, and it's so. I would imagine. I'm curious your observations, but I would imagine the investment into that people change is probably the correct amount of investments not put into it, right? I mean,
absolutely.
We send people to some leadership training or training on whatever software you're going to be using, or even like agile training or whatever it might be. But just straight up, like, hey, we're going to invest in you on what it means to be constantly adapting and constantly changing. It's probably a lot of underinvestment out there, right?
Yeah, I think underinvestment would be an understatement. I think that I just don't think that most organizations have that even within their sort of, within their line of sight at this point. And the thing, a leadership development program even, it's a relatively small investment at most organizations compared to, a big technology refresh or whatever. And I don't know many organizations today that are doing things like, AQ assessments for individuals or teams, or even talking about AQ, or doing adaptability programs, or providing coaching to help people with change, not with performance, but with change. Or even, for that matter, developing robust and, I would say, always on soft skills training, because we know, the more and more the rote routine and sort of repeatable tasks can be automated, the more important the human stuff. We've been talking about humanity and transformation to begin with, but the more important the human stuff about kind of like what we bring to work and how we engage in work and what skills are not easily automatable, the more important those things become. But I feel like in a lot of ways, work has stripped those things out of us, right? We've kind of over the course, for those of us who are old enough, we've been, it's like we've been taught to work like machines, not to work alongside machines. And working alongside machines requires us to bring human skills to the table, soft skills to the table, in a way that probably many people don't today.
Yeah, and you'd think some great leaders out there, they'd be looking at this hockey stick curve and they'd say, hey, to their employees, whether you're here with us or somewhere else, you're going to be encountering this as a human. And so we need to invest in you to give you the skills to deal with this rate of change, regardless, quite honestly, if you're here or somewhere else, just an investment into the value. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's scary. I'd love you to elaborate a little bit on those AQ assessments. What are they?
Sure.
What do you get out of them?
So, I mean, obviously, people are familiar with IQ, and I think increasingly people are becoming familiar, or at least aware of emotional intelligence, and EQ, the role that plays in decision making, in leadership, and in things like that. So there's sort of like a third lane, adaptive intelligence or adaptability intelligence, which actually can be measured. So there are some organizations, including one called AQAI, for example, that offers an AQ assessment that looks at 15 different dimensions across sort of 3 general areas, ranging from sort of your attitudes and aptitudes to your competencies to the environment you're in. And just like any other assessment tool, scores your level of adaptability in this case specifically. And when you look at the kinds of things that make up adaptability, things like your personal level of grit or resilience, or the degree to which, let's say, your environment is risk adverse or risk open, for lack of a better term, or the degree to which they give you sort of like, things like even like mindfulness and so forth are acceptable in an organization. Many of these things are changeable. In the case of the personal things like grit and resilience and sort of change readiness, or an ability to unlearn and relearn, those are skills that can be developed. They become like muscles, just like any other skill, that the more adept you become at spotting change, or the more adept you become at unlearning old skills that no longer serve you and learning new skills, obviously the easier it becomes to turn that into a habit. Other things like environment might be out of an individual worker's purview, but certainly is within the purview of the leader in an organization, right? So if you as a leader run AQ assessments across a sample or even everybody in your workforce and find that the same points of friction that are holding people back from feeling that they can lean into change are coming up as they, as they point to the different factors of their environment. Obviously, as a leader, you now have a sense as to whether there is something innate to your environment that is causing people to be more stagnant, more change resistant, and so forth. And obviously, as a person, as an individual, if you find that your environment is just wholly unworkable, I can't grow, I can't change, I can't even be adaptable in an environment that is so rigid, structured, so change adverse, then of course that gives you a clue that maybe it's time to look someplace else.
Well, I love that it's got a path to improvement. And I guess I shouldn't be surprised, since it's all about adapting. But, some other frameworks that are out there, they sometimes just kind of lock you in a box, and people use it as an excuse. Like, oh, me, I'm just a Libra. And it's like, no, you're being a jerk.
Right,
You can't
exactly.
use this as an excuse.
Yeah, I mean, to me, what makes a good AQ assessment powerful is that it gives you a sense of where you have opportunities for growth, and so few, like really none of the 15 attributes in the AQAI assessment, none of them are fixed. Every single one of them has a path to growth and an opportunity to improve. And then it comes down to what's the framework you use. So again, going back to the Adapt Manifesto, it could be the 10 principles in that manifesto where you say, okay, well, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z because those will help me, to improve my adaptability. Or it could be, virtually anything. I mean, obviously you'd come up with any framework and say, okay, here are the 10 things I will do to increase my adaptability. Or I will, find a coach who specializes in change or whatever.
Interesting. And something I love to do is to kind of poke around to areas that we think are like shrouded in BS that are out there. I think you and I both kind of have a disdain for the digital transformation phrase. I'm curious, like, where else are you seeing the BS that's out there right now? Too many buzzwords or nonsense? I
mean, I think that it's virtually everywhere. And I mean, I think you would I'm guessing you would agree that, kind of there's always some amount of sort of truth hidden within the BS or alongside the BS. I tend to see BS anytime anything becomes too absolute black and white. So when you look at the rhetoric, for example, around automation and artificial intelligence and sort of widespread technological unemployment, is that a possibility? Sure. Is it a practicality? Not really, right?
Right.
When you look at what AI really can do versus what we pretend AI can do, the use cases are relatively narrow and limited, at least for the foreseeable future. It is not nearly as powerful as, we pretend it might be. Today, obviously, the things that are I see are like just like bullshit machines. Is Web3. I believe that there is potential. There's plenty of promise. There are a lot of applications for Web3 technologies like blockchain and crypto. There is a lot of potential and promise for Web3 sort of mental models like decentralization, distribution, democratization. But a lot of the, kind of the rhetoric, for example, around the extent to which Web3 will replace, obliterate every model that came before it, I think is kind of BS-y, right? The same way Web 1 exists alongside Web 2 today, Amazon and Google on the Web 1 side, Facebook and, Twitter and Web 2 or whatever, these models will exist in parallel. The decentralized organization, the DAO or whatever it becomes, will exist alongside traditional corporate, structures. Not everybody, it's not even feasible that everybody will become a creator, like with their own coin and build their own individual economy with their own community of followers. Like, who's the community if everyone's a creator? Where do the doctors, the lawyers, the accountants, the engineers come from, right? Like, there's, does everything need to be on the blockchain? How do we do that? We don't have the energy to even support that, right? You can't be both interested in sustainability and sort of environmental impact and thinking the entire world is going to go onto the blockchain, right? Like, to just, you can't be both of those things at once, right? The world needs to, everything needs to be in balance, right? So I think, you see a lot of BS around stuff like that. And, typically when you see a lot of BS like that, what do you see? You see big brands feeling like they have to be first movers into something. And they do these things that amount to little more than ill-advised PR stunts that over the long haul probably hurts the business or the brand, right? So I think that, is kind of like the BS and the dangers of falling prey to the BS and not being more measured and strategic in the way you think about how these things fit into the sort of environment at large. So there's Web3, there's metaverse, right? All this stuff. I do believe there's something there. I do believe these things will become increasingly important. I do believe they will introduce everything from new ways to connect with employees and customers to entirely new business models. But I don't think it's going to be, probably will not arrive as quickly as some people profess it will. Despite a lot of the rhetoric, even with digital transformation, disruption is not an overnight event, right? Like the companies who are scrambling with digital transformation today could have started 20 years ago, right? But they didn't. That's why it's this game of catch up right now. But it didn't happen overnight, and the shift to any of these new, whether it's the next generation of the internet, isn't going to happen overnight. It isn't going to be absolute, I don't believe. But we do need to be thinking about where are we going, what might it look like, and what steps can we take to prepare ourselves and to experiment and to learn what this will mean for our organization.
Yeah, we're not going to take the Web 2.0 box, put it to the curb, and just come in from the store with our Web 3 box. Right, and the hype cycle is real.
Right, and just as importantly, what do you think? Like, Amazon's going to go, all right, we had a good run here, but our time is up. Take it. Good luck to you, whoever comes next. It's like that's never going to happen, right?
I guess everything's decentralized now. We're all going to go home. Thank you.
Shut down those AWS servers. Everyone's got a server in
Yeah.
the basement now.
The hype cycle's real. We've seen it before, but the funny thing is, a lot of real money gets spent during that hype cycle. But then, as the dust settles, there'll be some cool, meaningful changes on the other
Absolutely.
side,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I'm not, by no means am I saying, oh, let's be Luddites. Let's, stick firmly to our existing infrastructure and business models. But, we've got to get through that hype cycle, get into that trough of disillusionment or whatever Forrester or Gartner calls it. And then, we will find the practical applications that make sense and that work and that are relevant for consumers, like, right, what are their preferences, and and how do we provide something that serves them, right? At the end of the day, that's what it's about. We've got to serve customers. So if our customers are changing, we need to change with them, but at the same time, we don't need to we don't need to be shiny object chasers.
Yeah, I've been wondering if with Web3 we need like Luddite 3.0, and we'll redefine what a Luddite is in this new modern era. So, Greg, I've enjoyed this. I always like to finish on, I'd love it if you would share with us the best advice you've ever received in work or life.
Jeez. Wow. I didn't know you were going to have a stumper question. It's an interesting, I guess maybe this kind of plays into where we were kind of going on, in the later part of the conversation about Web 3.0. There was a time in the last internet bubble, I was working inside a traditional organization, but in an innovation role, working with a lot of companies that were building brand new digital things. And that created an opportunity where my boss and I actually both would get invited into a lot of friends and family for a lot of IPOs. He, when that was a relatively new experience to me. I was relatively young, certainly compared to where I am now. Was not investing in a lot of companies for sure, and we would get into these crazy IPOs, and we'd see people get into these pre-IPO friends and family rounds, and ride it and make $1 zillion, right? And he said to me, and there was one instance, I won't say the company, but it was a company that minted more than a few billionaires. We got a little friends and family stock, and he said, and I was like, I don't know what to do. Like, do I, ride this and hope it doesn't crash? Do I do? And he goes, and basically his advice, I can't remember exactly what his wording was, but it was basically don't be greedy. It was like, look, have a number in your head. When it hits that number, feel comfortable getting out. Even if it continues to go up beyond that, you've made more than you would have made otherwise. So it was this kind of concept of when the world is going crazy around you, be happy with the gains you get. And I think, especially now as you're watching people become, Bored Ape millionaires and wondering why your, farting ferret is sitting at half an ETH and isn't going up, kind of be happy with the gains you get, because you're still doing better than you were before.
That makes a ton of sense. I love it. Well, Greg, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It was good talking to you.